All right. Hope everyone's doing well. We're going to pick up our discussion that we started last week. I know just the nature of the way we do life is some of you weren't here last week, some of you were, and some of you were here probably, I don't remember, what did we talk about? Which?
Don't I? Jesus. We talked about Jesus.
Jesus, good answer. Yes. But see, people will do that to me. They'll come up to me during the week and say, well, what you talked about on Sunday? And I'm trying to think, what did I talk about on Sunday? I mean, I've done 2 other preparations since then. I can't recall. I have to look at the notes. So what we started talking about was the idea, the understanding that Jesus is more interested in our orthopraxy than our orthodoxy. 2 words that mean, well, roughly mean, do we have the right teaching and belief, or do we have the right practice and action? Orthopraxy, think practice. Orthodoxy, the right teaching, the right understanding.
Is that kind of the same concept what we just talked about?
It kind of, not that when I started this last week, I hadn't looked at the lectionary reading. I hadn't even thought about what I was going to do. But there's an overlap between what we started last week.
Practice versus
right.
thought. Yeah.
Right. So, thank you. I hope you understood. And if you didn't, you're welcome to always ask questions and say, please explain what in the world were you saying? But that idea that the atheism of the Old Testament, when you see people saying, in the Proverbs or in like Psalm 14, there is no God, what that really means is not, a declaration about the way reality is constituted and whether there's a divine being. It's about, hey, it doesn't matter. He's not going to know anyway. So I'll just do what I want. That's it. So again, it's about practice, not about like a belief that you hold in your head. It's about how you live. So we started talking about that. I illustrated that out of the parable that Jesus gives about the man with the 2 sons. One says, I won't go work in the vineyard, but he does go. And the other one says, I will go, but he doesn't go. And Jesus asks, well, which is the one who really did what the Father wanted? And everyone knows, well, it's the one who actually went. No matter what he said at first, the fact that he went is the one who actually did the Father's will. So I know that that's a bit of a stretch, but I'm using that as an illustration. Jesus sets up that difference between what you say and what you do to say maybe the orthopraxy is more important than do you confess certain doctrines with your mouth, right? Daryl.
I was just thinking, James 1, he actually emphasizes that point between faith, trust, and actions, doesn't he, in a way?
Yeah, I've got that down here, yeah. Okay. No, I like it when we're tracking. I like it when you're thinking what I'm thinking. Yeah, James says, the devils believe and tremble. They believe Jesus is the Son of God. They've got their orthodoxy down. The problem is their orthopraxy is really awful. Their practice is not in accordance with their confessed belief, right? And that's James's whole point is, so what if you make these statements that you believe? The devils do. What do? I'll show you my faith by my works, right? By my actions. I'll demonstrate, which is why I said the statement, I don't remember who said it, but we only believe as much as we do. If we use that standard, I only believe as much as I do. All my allegations, all my statements are not worth a dime. All I really believe is what I do. I can say I believe in all these things, but do I do it? If I don't do it, I really don't believe it. Right?
He doesn't believe, he knows.
Do what?
He doesn't believe, he knows.
You're right. Yeah, not belief where it's kind of I think so, but I'm really convicted about. What am I convicted about? It's obvious in how I live. And I think Jesus is getting to that. So we use that to talk about the idea. We noticed at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, because I like to begin with Jesus always, and then begin with the Sermon on the Mount, which is like the core of Jesus's teachings on the Christian life. And so we noticed in Matthew 5:16, he says, let your light so shine, and he defines that as good deeds, right? The light shining is your good deeds, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your fathers in heaven. So he's expecting at the beginning, this is a lived reality for you, right? He's not asking anyone to sign a doctrinal statement about what they adhere to doctrinally. He's talking about how you live. We also noticed a little bit later in 5:19, where he says, the one who keeps and teaches these. And he puts it in that order, keeps and teaches. So the orthodoxy follows the orthopraxy, right? So let's go back there in Matthew 5, because I want us to notice, we got through 19, but notice how the praxis comes before the orthodoxy, the practice before the teaching. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. He puts it in the order of keeping takes precedent. It has to lead the teaching, or it's just talk, right?
Don't do as I do as I say.
Yeah. Well, I love the way everyone's setting me up. This is great. So this is verse 20. The next verse, this is where I want to take it. My app is not showing me verse 20. That's not good. I think I'm going to have to close it and reopen it. I hate it.
Well, while you're finding it,
Yeah.
I was really convicted this morning when you were preaching, because I used to we have a lot of homeless people downtown, and I used to buy McDonald's gift cards and give them when anybody asked for food. I haven't done that in a while, and I thought, now I'm out with my little phone, and I don't have any money to give anybody. And I thought, I need to go get me some more McDonald's gift cards, because that's a really good thing to do, because it's just a few blocks to McDonald's, and people can get something to eat, and that's all they can do with that card is get something to eat.
Yeah.
And I thought, I need to get back on that, because my excuse has been lately, I don't have any money with me. That's a way to start helping people eat again. And
Yeah.
between your sermon and feeding the 5,000,
You got doubly convicted.
that's right.
So you're gonna go buy 5,000?
Hey, I want a fixed income. I can only buy $50 worth. Still, that's 10 cards. And I don't have occasion, it's not every day. It's
Yeah.
not even every week that somebody approaches me asking for money for food.
But it'd be nice, to be prepared, to have something you can give, And the idea I was, think of it in the radical way of, and when you do that, God comes into existence, right? God comes into existence for that person and between you and that person, because there's a flow of love, so God has been made real, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. Well, good.
There's the interesting thing that I've observed and read about many times is that organizations will have these statements. This is what we believe in. Vision statements. Yeah, or they're creed, right? And I tell my students, ignore that. Look at what they pay attention to. What they do, not what they say.
Yeah, because every business has a lofty values on their statements, but the question is, are they living up to that? Is that just kind of aspirational, or are they really living into it? Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Jesus is getting to. But let's go where Alan was prompting us. So in verse 20, after he says, those who keep and teach, he says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And that could mean a lot of things. But one of the things I think it does mean is what he says in the same gospel in chapter 23, when he's critiquing what's wrong with the scribes and the Pharisees. We're in Matthew 23. He says, starting in verse 2, well, we'll start in verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses, in other words, a teaching position. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. Well, if in the Sermon on the Mount he says you've got to exceed their level of righteousness, what is their level of righteousness? Orthodoxy without orthopraxy. Actually, it's not that hard to exceed their level of righteousness. Because I've always kind of thought, well, boy, people must have been stunned. How can we be more righteous? The point Jesus is making is they're not really righteous. It's a lot of talk. It's a lot of hot air. They're not actually doing anything. They don't love their neighbor. They don't care for the poor. They don't even care for their parents, right? He criticizes them. Their parents are in need. I'm sorry, I've dedicated that to the Lord. I have a religious obligation. You'll have to go in need, Mom and Dad. He's like, what in the heck is this? What's wrong, right? So Jesus seems to prioritize practice over belief, like a formulated belief in your head. Okay, formulated beliefs can be helpful. I'm trying to formulate some right now, right? For all of us, we're trying to think about. So it's not that they're not helpful at all, but they accomplish very little until we put something into practice. So I got a lot of reactions from what I said last week, and some people saying they never heard me say it, which is fine. That just means when I said it, it just didn't register. But I said, and I got a good reaction because people are thinking about it. And it kind of goes to what Ken is saying about you look at the reality. People have their mission statements, businesses, but then pay attention to what they are paying attention to. You'll know whether it lines up. So what I was saying was we tend to think that we plan and then implement. But reality is we experiment and then we reflect. What I mean by experiment is you try something that you don't know. I mean, you hope in trying it, you hope it'll lead to something good. I mean, you don't try something thinking, I think this is going to be a disaster. Let's try it. You try, but it's an experiment. Because if you've not done it, and you don't know what's going to happen, you're just, okay, what we're going to do is we got a little plan here, but it's not simply make a solid plan and implement it. Our little plan is something we're going to experiment with, and then we're going to reflect on what exactly did we learn by actually doing it. And that's where the real learning process happens, when we sit down together and go, so how'd that go? We tried doing this. What did we learn? Well, might have learned we don't want to do that again. It didn't work at all. Right? So I think that's much more in the mode of what Jesus is saying is practice comes first. Orthopraxy needs to take precedence over orthodoxy. We really only work out our orthodoxy in hindsight, after having tried things and put them into practice. Back to the Sermon on the Mount. One more verse on this idea of Jesus prioritizing practice. Matthew 7. So now let's go to the end of it. Couple famous parts at the end, right? The very last part of the Sermon on the Mount is the children's song about the man who built the house, right? One on sand, one on the rock. We all did that song probably if you grew up in church. The wise man built, right? Yeah, exactly. That's the very last thing. But a little before that, there's a section starting in verse 21. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does practice the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Right? The emphasis is about doing, not simply a statement of belief. Lord, Lord, you are the Lord. I don't care if you say that. mean, it's kind of why Jesus never really asked anyone to believe in him as the Son of God. Like that he really didn't ask them to do that. He definitely asked them to live certain ways and love their neighbors and forgive and don't judge. He asked people to do things. He really didn't ask them to sign on to a belief about his divinity. All right? So here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he's saying it's about doing the will of my Father. Then notice verse 24, the beginning of the famous little song, right? Or what we've turned into a song. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And conversely, if you go down, everyone who hears my teachings, verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them is the guy building on sand, right? The whole point is practice, action, what you do. Not about a bunch of doctrines to be believed, but a life to be engaged, to be practiced, and I would even say to experiment with. Because he asks us to do some crazy things. Like in the Sermon on the Mount, what are some of the crazy things Jesus asks us to do? Anyone think of some crazy things?
Cut off your hand.
Yeah, that's in there. I mean, yeah, we know it's metaphorical, but what are you talking about? Yeah, it's like crazy. What are you talking about? Cut off your hand, plug out your eye. What's that about? Right? But it's action. You need to take some serious action about certain things, right? What about turn the other cheek? What about love your enemies? It says love your enemies. That sounds crazy. Right?
Take the log out of your own eye.
Yeah, get the log out of your. Well, that sounds crazy. What a crazy idea that I should look first at the log that's in my eye rather than a speck in someone else's. Right? There are all these things to do, and when you listen to them, you're wondering, what does this mean? How do I do this? And what will happen if I do? Right? If I just worry about the log in my eye and not the speck in theirs, won't they get away with stuff? Right? Don't they need someone to be I'm going to be their accountability partner, right? I'm going to hold them accountable. What would happen if we really turn the other cheek? That's always what's worrying. What if I turn the other cheek? What'll happen then, right? Because in some ways it's an experiment that you will only know whether he's speaking truthfully after you do it and you reflect. Was he right? Is that a better course of action? You can't know ahead of time. Ahead of time, it sounds like loving your enemies. How would that ever work in the world? Well, you're going to have to experiment and actually try doing that. And then let's sit down and have a discussion. Now, what do you think about having tried something that sounds difficult, impossible, right? Or like cutting off your hand. What if I take this drastic action to root out something in my own life? Well, it's all theory while I'm considering it as a possibility, but until I put it into practice, experiment with it, I'll never know what he would say, whether he was right or not.
When and your sermon prompted me, because I read that Jesus calling Eva this morning about secret sins, and
Yeah, cutting off some hands.
I don't want anybody to go, kind of off the cliff on secret sins, but just sins that we do by omission is, what Windows was talking about. And then, what I do. And one of the things I was reading that an experiment and reflect, and I keep trying to say I'm going to do it, and I haven't, because it's omission, is pray before every action you take every day. And
Don't challenge us, Alan. I don't want to be challenged like that.
so where I read that was, it doesn't have to be
A long prayer,
like
yeah.
2, 3, 4 minute prayer, but just pray that I say the right things to him when I run into him at church today. 'Cause I saw Tim and he's smoking outside. But where I'm going is just like, it doesn't take that much. And we all know that's not right.
And we know it's not true.
And he just, I just picked it up, I was gonna put it in the trash. I didn't. But it's, that is an experiment
Yeah.
to reflect.
I love it. I love it. You remember years ago when Mark Scandrett came with the Church Basement Road show, and he runs that thing out in San Francisco called Seven, which he says is a Jesus dojo. If you know what a dojo is, it's a place where you go to practice your karate moves. And it's his metaphor for the church. Let's stop being churchy. And it's a place to go practice the moves, right? That then out in because that's what you do at a dojo. You learn the moves of karate so that you can then do them later. So he calls their community a Jesus dojo. We go there to practice the moves. And they did stuff like that. They took Jesus literally. They had this project. If you remember, they had this project, have two, give one. Where Jesus said, if you've got two cloaks, give one to someone else. They took that literally as a community. They said, okay, what do we have excess of? We're going to give away half of our stuff we don't need. They did it literally. And they're doing the same thing. They experiment. What would it be like if we really did what Jesus said? Right?
So my challenge for every male, because I have failed on this already this morning, is not praying before I spoke to my wife in any kind or not so kind way. And she's up there going, holy cow, what is he talking about? He's practicing that.
No,
To speak for my wife, she does not like that, but I do know what she thinks, and sometimes I do share what I think she thinks.
But I love your I love your challenge, because that's the exact sort of thing to say, what would it be like if I actually tried that?
Yeah.
And then to talk about it, with one another, say, well, we tried that. That's kind of what Lent is, it's a,
We failed.
yeah. And how did it go? What did I learn? What I didn't learn? I found it was harder than I thought it was, whatever, but you still learn. That's what I think Jesus is talking about. He, at the end of this Sermon on the Mount, says, it's all about whether you're going to do this, folks. I don't care if you say, Lord, Lord, and blah, 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 blah. I want to know, did you do what I'm talking about? The radical stuff I'm talking about, right? Now, I'm going to anticipate objections, but you all are too nice to make them. So I said, you just hadn't thought of it yet to push back. So I said, Jesus doesn't really ask anyone to believe in him as the Son of God. And someone could have said, wait a minute, I think I know passages where he did. So I'm going to take one of those passages and I want us to look at it. What does he really mean? Okay? So this is the Gospel of John. It's going to have to be John for these kinds of statements. So John chapter 8, I wanted to see a place where we tend to pull this out and say Jesus is saying believe in a doctrine. But I want us to see, is that what he's saying? Or is it still about practice? So the verse is John 8:24. And it says, Jesus is speaking, therefore I said to you that you will die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. Doesn't that look like an appeal to believe in the fact that Jesus is the Savior, the Son of God, come down from heaven? Isn't that what he's saying? Believe in me, like believe this to be a truth that you adhere to, or you'll die in your sins. Notice what happens in the conversation. Let's go down to verse 31 and 32. What does he mean by believe in me? So verse 31. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine. Okay, who are these people now? People who have believed. But he's saying what? You're not really truly disciples of mine until what? You continue in my teaching, right? In my word. In other words, to acknowledge that intellectually, well, that's good, but it's nothing yet. You're not a disciple until you do something. A disciple is a follower, and a follower is not someone who thinks things in their heads. It's a person who actually imitates, emulates, does the things he did. So after this part where he's saying, you need to believe that I am he tells the people who did, but you got to do something, right? You've accepted this as, okay, that's the case. You are this one. Well, now you aren't going to be disciples until you do something. Verse 32, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So when will they know the truth? After they do it. If you continue in my teaching, in my word, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. If they will put into practice, if they accept the fact, okay, you are the teacher, great. Now, you're going to have to do something, and then you will know on the back end. That you follow how that's consistent with what we've been talking about? Right? And there is a way we have to start with enough willingness to at least risk the experiment, right? Of course we do. If you think, oh, he's a complete charlatan, he's a con man, he's a liar, well, then I'm not going to experiment and try what he's saying. But if I allow the possibility, well, maybe he could possibly be onto something when he says, love your enemies. So I believe it enough to try it, and then I will know what it was he was telling me. The true knowing comes after the trying, the doing, the practice.
I was just thinking, in a way, this is a novel way of thinking about this. Because naturally, when you see it throughout, I guess, Christian conversations, it's more about belief than it's first, and execution. And so it makes me wonder, why do we have a propensity, and my thinking is, because I'm convicting myself, because it's the easy part, and I can actually say, this is how I think. The hard
Bing.
part is actually doing it.
I agree. I think the reason we focus on we prioritize orthodoxy, that's far easier than orthopraxy. We can put on our website the doctrines that this church believes, which if you look at ours, we have no statement. Actually, if you read what I wrote, it says we try and do and believe the things talked about in the creeds and from the councils of the church. I put it in that order. We try and put these things into practice, right? So I agree. I think the reason we like to talk about orthodoxy and indicting ourselves is that's far easier. It's far easier to say, do you believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God that is inerrant? And, yes. Well, do you do what it says? Well, it says love my neighbor, and I'm not into that, but I do believe it, right? It's so much easier to believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that the Bible is his word, and, it's easy to believe, and all these things are true, and I believe them to be true. It's a lot harder to practice any of that. So I think that's the reason. And I like the fact that, we're not throwing others under the bus. We're confessing ourselves. It's a lot easier to say, I believe these things than to do any of them. That's where it gets hard, right? So I think but that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's always talking about doing and knowing after you do.
I thought it was like reading those.
Well, that matters a whole lot. If you're in the right church building, you are in the right. Yeah, Jim?
It also seems like to say I believe something doesn't require any reflection, doesn't require any introspection. I can say I believe this and then be done. But if I really believe it, then I've got to judge my own actions. I've got to judge my own heart. And usually it's not going to be consistently fun.
Yeah. Another way in which it's a lot easier to focus on the doctrines I believe than to get into the messy business of actually trying to practice it. Because, I'll discover all my own inadequacies when I try and put it into practice. Yeah, for sure.
Politicians tell you insider trading is illegal and you'll go to jail, and yet we found out that most of the Congress people are trading on inside information on their committees,
Yeah.
et cetera. And I think it comes back, I keep thinking about it. I mean, if you say a prayer before an action, if this is a secret sin or something like that, I mean,
Ooh.
you know,
Yeah.
God help me with, okay, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's when you're, yeah, if I'm going to take that to where I'm really going to pray, then all of a sudden I'm confronted with, I know what I'm about to do is not in keeping with asking God's blessing or God, yeah, it will, like Jim's saying, it's going to illuminate in my heart and my actions and what's going on with me, and that's uncomfortable, right? Uncomfortable. But I love that video. That video that I took, Wesley's so good. That was an 11-minute video, and I said I want to stop it right on her statement about loving life, love me into life. I said just stop it there. Keep some of the video, put a little music with it, so it doesn't look like we just hacked somebody's video, an 11-minute video, and just. He's so talented. He did that, right?
It's great to have him.
He's a hacker.
Yeah. When it comes to video, he can do that. But I chose that because I love what she's saying. She's saying the judgments of God are here to help me. And I loved her way of saying, God is judging me when he's asking me, when I'm about to do X, Y, or Z, he's saying, is that really going to bring you life? That's judgment. That's not like, I'm going to condemn you if you do that. No, it's like, is that really going to grow you into a fuller life? And often we'll admit, well, no, it really won't. It's sin for a season. It's, we start realizing, no, it's not a fuller life. It's something else. And her point was that's the judgment of a loving God who's not here to condemn us for our thoughts, but here to get us to think about our thoughts, our actions, so that then we grow realizing he's loving us, he's not condemning us, he's trying to help me. I don't have to be afraid of revealing to him what it is I'm thinking about doing. He'll help me decide whether I need to do that or not.
God knows us better than we know ourselves.
Yeah, someone has said that. Yeah, he's closer to us than we are to ourselves, right? Okay.
And all that has to be is God help me. It
Right.
doesn't have to be a long prayer.
No. Just to be cognizant of God, that AA sort of idea of conscious contact. It doesn't even have to include words. It's just bringing God into my mind as I engage, as like you're saying, before I do everything. Just have a little picture of, I'm doing this in the presence of God, and God, and that will start to clarify, what am I actually doing? And what do I want to do in the presence of God? What furthers life?
That's too hard. Can we talk about that church down the road?
Can't we condemn people who are wrong? Remind ourselves that we're so right.
I prayed before I came up on Tim's smoke, and I guess I would have said, can I have a hit?
All right, so I want to prep us for next week. So I want to tell you a little story. And I did this a few weeks ago on Wednesday night, but that tends to be a different group who tunes in on Wednesday night, Zoom. So I thought it's safe to do it here. It's not going to be repetitive for most people. So back when I was finishing my graduate program, my professor in church history, Dr. Everett Ferguson, he's a way more brilliant guy than I knew at the time. I'm really ashamed of the fact that I did not know how brilliant he really was. I've discovered it recently when I was looking at an English translation of St. Gregory of Nyssa's The Ascent of Moses, which is supposed to be this classic of kind of a devotional, metaphorical reading of the life of Moses. My professor was the translator from the Greek of what is today the English translation of The Ascent of Moses. I did not know that. I respected the guy for sure. I just had no idea of who I was learning church history from, right? But at the end of my program, I thought, okay, I'd taken a bunch of courses with him. We'd done early church history, we'd done, medieval church history, we'd done Reformation history, we'd done all this stuff. And he's the kind of guy who tested you out of the footnotes. Like, not only did you read the text, did you read the footnotes? Because he's got a test question out of footnote 5 on page 342. You just accepted the fact you're not going to do well. This guy knows it, he's memorized it all, right? So I asked him, I wanted to ask him, after all this going through church history, I asked him, so what are the big takeaways about church history? Like, what do you think is like the big lesson? And here's what he said. He said that doctrine follows practice. Now, I'll tell you how I've thought about that up until about the last 6 months. I thought he would say, unfortunately, the truth is, we do things and then we work out doctrines to justify them. That's what I thought he was saying. I thought he was lamenting the fact. If I'd been smart at that time, I would have asked him what he meant. I just heard it, thought I knew what he was saying, and went away with it like, well, how unfortunate that doctrines always follow practice. And I'm thinking that it should be the other way around. We should get our doctrines and then we should put them into practice. Now, I don't know what he meant, but I'm starting to think he might have meant that's the way it should be. And I've thought for all these years, and that was in 1989, I thought for all these years it was an admission of what is flawed about the life of the church. Because I'm always thinking, we get our doctrines and we put them into practice. We plan and we implement, right? Well, what if he was saying what you finally realize that is the work of God through his church is that practice always precedes doctrine, and that's the way it ought to be. What if he was saying that? So what in the life of the early church, and I'm going to talk, let's just talk New Testament. Let's talk the book of Acts. What happens where practice precedes doctrine? What happens where their doing gets ahead of them having any sort of doctrinal formulation for what actually they're already doing?
Embracing the Gentiles.
Embracing the Gentiles. That is a prime example, right? Nobody has a worked out doctrine about why the Gentiles and how the Gentiles ought to be accepted. They get pushed. Now, how do they get pushed into embracing the Gentiles? Who pushes them?
Paul.
Peter's vision,
Peter does, but who pushes Peter?
It's God with the visions, right? And stuff like that.
It's the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Peter gets a vision he does not want, right? Like, you ought to eat everything. He's like confused. He's thinking, what does that mean? I'm not supposed to eat unclean things. I've never eaten unclean things. I'm getting this vision from heaven saying it's not unclean, Peter. I don't eat that stuff. And then there's a knock down at the door while he's thinking about the vision, and it's Gentiles saying, they've had a vision that you're supposed to come. And Peter's like, I have never done this. You maybe we ought to pull up and read the text. When he gets into Cornelius' house, he says, basically, I've never been in a Gentile's house. I mean, he's admitting, I am extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Everything in me says this is wrong, and you are sinners. And yet, the Holy Spirit is pushing practice before there's doctrine. Now, they work out some of the doctrine when in Acts? Acts 15. Yeah. There's a big Jerusalem council after they've started welcoming in Gentiles to start figuring out what are our beliefs about what we're already doing. Because Paul's, not only now has been Cornelius, but now Paul and Barnabas have gone out and started doing this like big time out in Gentile lands. And we need to talk about this back in Jerusalem to work out the doctrine because we're already doing the practice, and we're doing the practice because we were led by the Spirit. And now we need to work out how do we understand what it is the Spirit has had us do. That makes sense? What else? Whoops, 12 o'clock, we'll have to stop. You got a whole week to think about what other
Share it all.
illustrations show the early church people doing and then figuring out the doctrines that then explain and provide understanding and framework to what it is they were doing. And it's not because their ego drove their doing, it's because the Spirit of God drove their doing. That makes sense? There's a big difference between me doing, that's what I thought Edward Ferguson was saying, is, look, we just self-willed people do what we want and then we work out doctrines that justify it. What if he was saying, no, the Spirit of God drives us to do things, not that we want, but that the Spirit wants, and then the doctrines follow in their wake as we start to put a framework and explanation and understanding how this actually is consistent with what God's always been doing. And we didn't realize it, right?
You know, both could be true.
I think so
The,
too.
the early church could have been doing that, like, you thought, but in reality, we ought to be doing the way you concluded that he was saying.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's definitely true that sometimes I have worked out doctrines that justify what I was already doing.
Yeah.
But those weren't doctrines of
All
God,
I'm
they were
thinking is-
explanations of
All I'm
grace.
thinking is he was a church history, type scholar.
Yeah.
And that reality is probably natural to
Yeah,
mankind.
and I agree, yes, it's not always been, but I just, yeah. You're right, it's probably both ways. When it's led by the Spirit, there is a Spirit-induced practice that precedes often the understanding and the framework of the teaching that then follows. And sometimes in church history, people have justified what they were wanting to do and worked out doctrines in the church, which then made it okay.
Do you think
I
we
was-
justified slavery that way?
No, we didn't do that. Yeah, there were plenty of sermons preached and texts used to justify chattel slavery in America. Yeah,
I was actually saying a positive, that we ought to be doing what you're talking about.
Right.
Unfortunately,
yeah,
mankind, we've been doing it.
yeah.
But it was saying that those doctrines that we embrace because they satisfy our needs,
Right.
get challenged, don't last over time.
The Spirit will, I think, at some point expose those for what they are.
Just like, the Jews said, well, no, I'm sorry, we can't have Gentiles, and then until they got challenged.
Right. Okay, well, think about some more maybe, and then next week we'll pick up with some more examples of maybe it's proper that practice, orthopraxy follows orthodoxy, and that's because the Spirit is at work. So, all right. Have a blessed week. Go in peace.